Okay, so we are talking about Saturn today. It is now, if you think about Saturn, is the only planet that gets its own class, right? This is the entire class devoted to Saturn. We didn't even give that to the Sun and the Moon and the Ascendant. Perhaps we should have. I should have, but we didn't, right? It's Saturn gets it. Jupiter doesn't get it. Next week, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they're important, but they get covered in 1 week. Saturn gets his own week. Um, Saturn is a remarkably important and useful planet in the chart. This is it's certainly true in the natal chart, and when we get to transits, you'll see that it is very, very important in predictive astrology. Saturn is, I would have to say, probably, well, now I don't want to get the sun and the moon mad at me, but Saturn is the most reliable, one of the most reliable planets in terms of its function in the chart. And the importance for those of us who are doing astrology of that cannot be underestimated because you want, when you're talking to somebody, you want to be able to say something that is going to strike home with them. And Saturn does that. Saturn always does that by in the natal chart and certainly by transit. Saturn is all, and the thing is, people are aware of it, right? This is not something that is like, oh really? This is like, oh yeah, I know. This is, you're able to really get where you want to go with people when you talk about Saturn because they are going to respond like, oh yeah, I know that's true. I got it. Let's talk a little bit about Saturn first astronomically. Um, we know that the fixed stars, the constellations, and other various other various planets, oh no, not planets, other stars, are essentially like a backdrop, which from our perspective is like an unmoved, well, it rotates, but unchanging backdrop that just keeps spinning around the sky every night. But the stars don't move with respect to each other unless you have a very, very long time horizon, which we don't. Um, and then we have the planets, which means the wanderers. And those, I mean, if you were just to be looking up in the sky and nobody told you the difference and stuff like that, you'd say, well, most of those stars just stay where they are, and some of them wander around. They move with respect to the others. And some of them move relatively fast, like the sun, the moon, Venus, and Mercury, and some of them move very slowly. Jupiter moves pretty slowly. Saturn moves very slowly. It takes 30 years to go around the zodiac, 29 and a half, really, but it takes 30 years to go around the zodiac. And it is the far, and, of course, people were able to figure out, in the solar system, it was like the Earth system in their perspective. The Earth was in the center, but they were able to figure out, I'll just call it solar system, they were able to figure out that the slowest moving planet must be the farthest away. I mean, because you have the experience with people walking by and you see it, and you figure it out. The slowest moving planet must be the farthest away. And so Saturn is the limit of our solar system. It's the last planet that we can see. And so the idea was, yeah, this is the end. This is the edge of our system at least. And after that you got a lot of space and then you get to the stars, whatever that business is out there. So so Saturn was right away perceived as being the limit. Saturn never gets too bright, gets kind of bright sometimes, but never gets too bright, is sort of perceived as well, it is a dull yellowish color. In Chinese astrology, it is literally called the Earth planet. And in Western astrology, for various reasons, it is also quite associated with Earth and the earthly concerns. Um, if we take that limit thing, right? Uh, Saturn is the planet that is the farthest out. It represents the limits. It represents those things that kind of keep us here in this realm, right? This is like, from our perspective, the earthly realm, with all of our concerns and things, it is the border, and the border, a limit, limitations, that which hold us in place. This is the first astronomical thing we get from Saturn. Um, it's kind of interesting, but a little off topic. But Saturn holds Jupiter in place, keeps Jupiter's orbit steady, right? Because they're not well, they're far away from each other, but they're both big objects and they affect each other's gravity. So Saturn holds Jupiter steady. And Jupiter is the most massive planet in the solar system. And Jupiter's gravity, Jupiter, of course, the big helper, right? Jupiter actually keeps the asteroids out where they are between Mars and Jupiter. And without Jupiter, the asteroids would be flying all around and winging into us and stuff like that. So Jupiter actually does protect us. But Saturn stabilizes Jupiter. Here's a not so astronomical thing about Saturn, but when you spell Saturn Saturn, lots and lots and lots of words that begin with st are Saturnian in nature, right? Stability,
Wow.
station, stayed, stress. You can keep st words are very, very Saturnian as a rule. There's not a lot of one wonder happy st words. They all tend to have a little bit of a Saturnian flavor to them. Okay, so Saturn seen as being kind of the limit planet, and it has I often say, we are in the Saturnian realm. Saturn is a planet that has a lot to do with rules. It has a lot to do with limitations. It has a lot to do with structure, another st word. It's a real Saturnian keyword, structure. And here we are. We are in a realm where there are all kinds of rules. And I don't mean like laws. I mean, well, those are also Saturnian. But there's time, there's space, there's causation. Things follow along this timeline this way, cause and effect. This thing has consequences and so on. All very Saturnian. So that's the Saturnian realm. When we talk about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we're talking about going beyond the Saturnian realm. But down here on the ground, Saturn. This is Saturn's realm. He's after all, he sort of has the last say, right? Because he's the furthest out. The sun, being the whole power source of the whole shebang, is really the most, is really the key player. But Saturn is the limit. Saturn is the limit out there. In mythology, so we always conflate the Greek and Roman gods. They certainly did it themselves. They said, okay, Venus, Aphrodite, although there's some interesting things we'll talk about someday. Venus, Aphrodite, Jupiter, Zeus, they just sort of made an equation there. And so in Rome, it was Saturn, and in Greece, Kronos. But they have slightly different origins. And in Rome, Saturn essentially was kind of a local god, and was the god of corn and associated with farming, you know, and farming. Another Saturnian point over here. Farming is a lot of hard work, and so I, we sort of like have these kind of images of the farmer out there with the. It's a lot of work to be a farmer. And it was recognized as such. But you put in the work, you get the harvest as a result. Interestingly, today my tarot card for the day was the Seven of Pentacles, and that's sort of an image of, if you're familiar with it, it's sort of the image of a young Saturn. It's a guy, you know uh, up against like a tree with pentacles hanging on it. He's got a hoe. This is it's like a farmer kind of card. It's a seven, and Saturn is the seventh planet. It's a very, very Saturnian card. Very appropriate for a day when you're talking about Saturn. So in Rome, that was the original association, but they eventually came to associate Saturn with the Greek Chronos. Chronos literally means time, right? And um, it seems like a technical point, but Saturn, Kronos was not a god. He was a Titan, right? One of the original beings. And um, he was the son of Uranus, the sky god, and Gaia, the earth goddess. So this was Saturn, the son of these two. I'm not exactly sure of the particulars of it, but Saturn decides that he's going to kind of take over the situation, and he castrates his father Uranus. And then he throws Uranus's. It depends whose story you read, but he throws Uranus's phallus into the ocean, and out of that, eventually Aphrodite is born. But, you know. Anyway, so Saturn, then grows up, and he is consorting with his sister Rhea, and there's another interesting aside. Rhea, nobody knows really what the origin is, but Rhea means flow. And if you think about Saturn as being stolid and not moving very much, and then there's Rhea, flow, flow, Rhea as in diarrhea, or logorrhea. If you keep talking, it's, logorrhea. That's the meaning of it. And so, they seem like an odd couple. Anyway, it's either through prophecy or probably Saturn's own, guilt type of thing that he becomes aware of the fact that his children are going to overthrow him, and of course he castrated his father, so he's very suspicious that this stuff happens. He realizes, and so whenever Rhea has a child, he swallows them. He swallows them whole, and so the kids are disappearing left and right. And this is this is way the days before family therapy and stuff like that. Things would turn out very differently now. We get counseling and things like that. Nah, back in the day, they just went on instinct, I guess. So Rhea's not too happy about the situation. She's a good mom. She doesn't want her husband swallow husband. She didn't want a brother or consort swallowing all the kids. So hatches this idea. Jupiter is born, and she takes a big rock, swaddles it in a blanket, and says, Saturn, hey, you want to see a new sun? He goes, oh, great. Swallows the rock whole, doesn't recognize it. He wasn't chewing, I guess. And then she sends Jupiter off to Crete. Well, it was Zeus, not Jupiter. I'm getting things confused here. I'm being astrologically correct, but sends Zeus off to Crete to be raised. Sure enough, Zeus comes back as an adult and manages to get hold of Saturn, knocks open his belly, and all the other goddesses and gods that had been swallowed there come out. They just start, Demeter, the earth god, the goddess of the harvest, and a whole bunch of them come out, and they set up shop. And indeed, the Titans, the original set of gods or godlike folks, are overthrown by Jupiter and his cohort, including his brothers Neptune and Pluto, or uh, Zeus and no, well, Pluto is Hades, and Neptune is, I forget. I read Oceanus, but that's not right. Anyways, what we get out of this whole story is that Saturn has a lot to do with fear, right? Saturn has a lot to do with fear, right? So Kronos. Now Kronos, time, right? So we also have, this is the Lord of Time. And if you're talking about limitations, time is the big limitation, right? Things don't go on forever. Everything kind of crumbles and comes down in time, right? So Saturn, Lord of Time, Lord of Time. And as the slowest moving planet, who has the longest cycle of the visible planets, it makes sense that he would be the Lord of Time. He would be the limit case for time. So when we talk about Saturn, we are talking about things that have a lot. We're talking about fears, limitations. We're talking about a very practical, let's remember the farmer part of things, the very practical, earthly oriented side of things. Sometimes Saturn is called the Lord of Karma. And indeed, he does seem to have a very cause and effect. You could sort of say that the Saturnian realm that we're living in is the realm of cause and effect, where there things have to follow a particular sequence of occurrence. So where Saturn is in the chart is where we have fears, where we have hesitations, where we have delays, where we need to put in a lot of work. Saturn kind of represents the shadow side of our personality. And at a deeper level, you could really see that. It's the things in yourself that you don't want to look at. But by but Saturn in the chart, in terms of things that you encounter in the world, is the stuff that you have a hard time with and you don't like it. You don't want to go near it. You don't want to touch it. By which I mean, ooh, let's talk about finances, right? So, because it's easy to talk about finances. Let's say second house, right? We're gonna look at the second house to see what's going on with finances. So let's say we put Libra on the cusp of the second house. Libra's on the cusp of the second house. Well, there's no planets in it, but we know that Libra is ruled by Venus. And then we would look to see, maybe Venus is in a sign like Virgo, that she's not where she is today, that maybe she's not thrilled to be in that sign. And then we'd say, well, this person may have a little bit of stress when it comes to finances because the ruler of the house is in a sign where it doesn't function all that easily, is going to have to put in more effort and so on. But the person isn't going to really mind it. They may struggle with it, they may be unhappy about the struggle, but it's okay, I'll do it. If Saturn is in the second house, the person has to deal with financial stuff. They probably, it's a tough row to hoe to make money and to keep it. And that's a very, very Saturnian, tough row to hoe. It's a very Saturnian phrase. Um, it's going to be something for them. There's going to be a little bit of stress in that area. But the difference is between these two scenarios, which might externally look exactly the same if you were to just measure the person's bank account from the person I talked about with Libra on the second house and the one with Saturn, it might look very similar. They might even have the same general types of complaints. But where Saturn is, you don't wanna. You don't wanna. And so the person with Saturn in the second will usually be something like, at least early in life, will be like, nah, I don't care about money, or I don't want to touch it, or don't talk to me about this, or yeah, I know I should have a better job. Or, like you get very sensitive about it. You don't want to go there. You don't want to go where Saturn is, you know, which is, it's different from just having other problems for that particular area of life. Where Saturn is, you just don't you just don't want to do anything really. You wish it would go away. I don't like it. It's not good. So the other side of that story though is if you put in the work, you usually can do something pretty good with that house. You can actually succeed very nicely in that area of life. It's always going to be work, and you probably are not going to think, here's my favorite part of the day. I've got to go deal with this issue, but you can do it. You can do it. Um, where Saturn is usually, I know I've said this a bunch of times, but it is really worthwhile. Where Saturn is, you typically have a lot of struggles and missteps, if not struggles. You usually have a lot of missteps until your Saturn return between the ages of 29 and 30. Till Saturn goes around the whole, essentially, Saturn has to go around your chart one time, and then you start to improve. Those a few basic rules about Saturn, a little bit of start at. So Saturn in the elements, okay, and almost really by sign, but Saturn in the elements. Saturn does not love to be in fire signs. If we look at the rulership, exaltation, fall thing, you can sort of see why. Saturn is the ruler, the traditional. By the way, it's interesting, right? Saturn Saturn castrated Uranus and lives in this sort of fear of like the what retribution is coming his way. And he was the ruler of Aquarius until Uranus was discovered, and then Uranus became the ruler of Aquarius. It's like, damn, it's like a little bit of karmic payback there. Or maybe not, I don't know. But it certainly is makes a good story. So Saturn, ruler of Aquarius, which means he's in detriment in Leo, a fire sign. And then Saturn is exalted in Libra, right? Which means the opposite sign of Aries is Saturn's fall. And then there's Sagittarius, which Saturn doesn't have any particular dignity or debility in, but it's Jupiter's home sign, and Jupiter's throwing a party every day and stuff like that. And what is Saturn doing there? He's not like the greatest thing. Fire signs are inspiration, excitement, right? Inspiration, excitement, action. Saturn is not inspired. Saturn doesn't excite, and Saturn really hesitates before acting. So Saturn doesn't do terrific in the fire signs. It's not the end of the world to have Saturn in a fire sign or anything like that. I mean, a quarter of the people do. It does make it a little bit harder to run your Saturn, though. It's that the Saturn himself is not particularly strong, so it's going to take extra effort to develop that the affected areas of life when he's in a fire sign. It doesn't mean too much in terms of specifics because Saturn spends about 2.5, 3 years in each sign. So everybody born between 1961 and 1963 has Saturn in Aquarius. It's probably 62 and 60, whatever. Anyway, a whole group has Saturn in Aquarius and so on. But it's not entirely the sign placement of Saturn isn't entirely irrelevant in the chart. First of all, you will find, and in her book Growing Pains, I've talked about it before, I know, Alex Chenoweth talks about the little Saturnian and Jupiter generations, and Saturn has to do, for a couple of years, a mini generation is born that has certain expectations about authority because Saturn represents authority figures. So they have the certain attitude towards authority. They have a certain sort of approach to the structure of their lives. It's pretty subtle, but it's one of the reasons why you can get along pretty well with people that were born around your time. It's sort of like, yeah, we were around at the same, we tend to think it's like because we watch the same TV shows or played the same games or something like that, and that's a big part of it. But also, you share that Saturnian sense of structure and that sense about the way the world works. Um, Saturn in Aries, particularly. Aries is a very individual sign. It's very impulsive. It's very action oriented. And Saturn in Aries, you have the issue of being able to or needing to come to some kind of a decent relationship with authority figures. Yeah, often Saturn in Aries rejects authority pretty straight up. Just doesn't see the value slash purpose. Doesn't want to feel that constraint, and it is a tough placement. Very similar for Saturn in Leo. It's a similar kind of thing. Um, I think the action-oriented sign of Aries is more difficult for Saturn than the fixed sign of Leo. Saturn is like, well, at least it's fixed. That's okay. At least it's fixed. Um, but it's not really Saturn's jam. And similarly with Sagittarius, Saturn is not really into this whole big picture exploration kind of thing. It has Saturn by sign has a subtle effect. Um, I think the folks in Aries have it the hardest. Saturn, but Saturn struggles in fire signs. In water signs, Saturn is pretty neutral. Um, he is in detriment in Cancer, however, because it's opposite his home sign of Capricorn, so he's in debility there. And what you often see with Saturn in Cancer is that there's a kind of a clannishness about things, a sort of this is the way we do things. You know, this is the way my family does things. My father and my father's father did blah blah blah, and you'd be like, yeah, well, was it good? Was it, that's the way we do things. Saturn in Aries tends to encounter authority figures who say, because I said so, right? It's the authority of me because I said so. A little Saturn and Leo too, because I said so. That you tend to encounter authority figures there, and that is part of why you don't like them if you have Saturn and Aries and Leo. You're like, well, what do you mean? Because you said so. Well, what's that about? So Saturn and Cancer, very a little bit of an issue there as well. Um, Saturn in Scorpio uh, is not in such a bad position. The actually scorpionic issues of that, you know, things like other people's finances and birth, sex, and death, and all of these things. Saturn helps you to take these things seriously. Um, have a steady kind of view towards it. It's not a particular detriment. I don't think Saturn likes being in Scorpio very much, but it's not really bad. And then Pisces, which we've just had 2.5 years of Saturn in Pisces, so we know all about it. Um, and Saturn is okay in Pisces. He does, it's a mutable sign, and the two signs that Saturn rules or ruled were Capricorn, which is cardinal, and Aquarius, which is fixed. And then um, the sign of Pisces is mutable, and so he doesn't have any mutable. He doesn't rule any mutable. He's not mutable. His sister Rhea is mutable, of course, but he's not. But he's not mutable. So Pisces is, not such a thing. Air signs loves air signs. Air signs are the best for Saturn. First of all, he was the ruler of Aquarius, and he is in exaltation in Libra. uh, the exaltation in Libra, fair and balanced. And that's very Saturnian. We're going to get, nobody's getting away with anything, you might say. We're going to keep things on an even keel. That's very Saturnian. He really likes that. Um, it's fair. And that is part of Saturn's thing. Saturn is fair, right? You put in the work, Saturn rewards you to the proportion of the work that you have put in. And when you have not done your best, Saturn takes out of the reward the difference and says, okay, well, you didn't do it. So, this is what you get. So Saturn is fair, and Libra is about balance. It's fair. So Saturn loves that. Aquarius, very principled sign, air oriented. And even Gemini, Saturn gets along okay in Gemini. These are all the air signs are have to do with communication, thought, and stuff like that. And so Saturn really, helps to steady the process. But thought itself is a step-by-step kind of process. Real thought is a step-by-step process, and Saturn is okay with that. So Saturn really does pretty well in the air signs. In the earth signs, well, he rules Capricorn. That is his home sign, so he's doing really, really good there. Um, and again, it is Capricorn, the structures of society. It is, remember, think about the sun in Capricorn. One succeeds not because of being selfish and wanting to succeed. One succeeds because one dedicates oneself to the purpose. Right? Whatever we're doing over here, I am dedicating myself to that. The Capricorn is the mountain that you climb up. And so, and it's also, I mean, it's rocks and stuff like that. Saturn Saturn digs that. So that's his home sign. He functions very well there. Saturn does okay in Taurus. It's not a problem for him. It's an earthy sign, has a lot to do with stuff. We'll take it kind of slowly. And then Virgo, you know, you're going to really pay a lot of attention to the details with Saturn and Virgo. There's going to, because Saturn doesn't let you get away with anything, and Virgo's about details, but it's also service. And Saturn, you're going to work and you got service, and it's actually the sign of the harvest. And Saturn is a farmer, so Saturn does okay in Virgo. It's a mutable sign, but so in the various signs, Saturn, he does okay, or he has some troubles and stuff like that. The only time when you're reading a natal chart that your eyes have to sort of widen a little bit is when Saturn is in Aries or Cancer. Because, and the reason is, and maybe Leo, and the reason is that in those signs, the person's encounter with authority figures was probably an encounter with folks that were not really Saturnian. They weren't really playing according to the rules. They weren't fair. They weren't, as I said, with Saturn in Aries, because I said so, or Saturn in Cancer, because this is the way we've done things in our family for 1,000 years, that type of thing. Um, in you should always take a look and see what sign it is in, but it's not going to have that powerful an effect. What's going to have a very powerful effect is the house that Saturn is in, and we'll just go through them from 1 through 12. I've already talked about a bunch of them, but it deserves its own thing. By the way, I think the cover has changed since I bought it. A lot of things, but Liz Green's book, Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. This is a great book. Liz Green is a famous and rightfully very, very well respected astrologer, and largely because of this book. This is the one that put her on the map in everybody. She wrote a couple of actually like kind of fun sun sign books before, and then there came something came this one, and she's written a bunch since then. This is a very, very good book on Saturn. This is so good that I actually brought it upstairs to show you. If you're going to be reading on Saturn, she has there's a whole school of astrology, sort of a loosely defined school of astrology, psychological astrology. Folks like Karen Hammaker-Zondag from the Netherlands, and Stephen Arroyo, we worked with Liz Green quite a bit. Um, Psychological astrology, like the psychology of things. Liz Green is probably, well, in my opinion, let's not pretend that there's any in my opinion, she's the best of the whole lot, and the others are pretty good. And this book is great at understanding like the psychological, if you want to understand the psychological dynamics of Saturn in, this house and so on. Saturn is also an indicator for the father. Now, that's getting to be a little old school, but the idea being here that the father is the authority figure in the, mom and dad and bud and sis, 4.3 person family unit there. Saturn is the authority figure, so it represents the father, and the moon is the mother as the nurturer. Indeed, the moon is a very maternal symbol. You can't get away from that. Um, in olden astrology, the tendency was to think of the sun as the father, as sort of the male model, and the moon as the mother. But in a more psychological sense, it's Saturn and the moon. And so a lot of time, yeah, and indeed, I mean, things may change a little bit and family structures change and gender stuff changes and all that, but indeed, Saturn tends to represent either the father or the more authoritarian. In any dynamic, there's always one. If you've got five people that are your caregivers, there's always one that is the authority person, and there's always one or two that you're going to a little bit softer about things and so on. Well, Saturn represents that. And, as she points out, things like, Saturn in Aries and something like that, like a lot of times is like a difficult relationship with the father or, all kinds of things. It's a very good book. Um, I don't do a lot of that. Your father was, or you did, but you can see that in the chart, and you can see, you probably had some conflicts with your father, or maybe your mother isn't necessarily the most maternal, given that you're, you know, well, I don't want to give examples because maybe some of you, but well, you would know anyways. If your moon is in Scorpio next to Pluto, it probably wasn't. Oh, you fell down. Let me get you a cookie. It's like, yeah, stand up and clean it up and don't bleed in the house. Um, so that type of dynamic, she really does it well. I don't do a lot of that, but she really does it well in that book. Okay, commercials over. Let's talk about Saturn in the houses. Um, Saturn in the first house is a real tricky one. And the closer it is to the ascendant, the trickier it is. And sometimes people are born with Saturn right on the ascendant. I think I gave you an example of that last week, as a matter of fact. A Saturn in Capricorn right on the ascendant, which is good, which is good. Um, well, no, if you're going to have Saturn on the ascendant, you want him to be dignified. That's the thing. You want him to be in a good spot. That's what you're looking for there. You don't necessarily want Saturn in Aries on the ascendant. But Saturn in the first house, the person tends to test themselves. Uh, the the sense of it is that they won't give themselves a break, right? This is the kid who got a 98 on the test and is kicking themselves they didn't get 100. This is the kid who came in second in a race of, with 15 kids, and it's just not good enough. They tend to be hard on themselves. They tend to be hard on themselves. They don't. The ascendant, the first house, it's me. It's the way I live my life. And there's Saturn there, and there's a certain kind of reserve and hesitation, but there's also typically, like, they do things. By all means, they do things. They go out into the world and do things, but they tend to take it kind of hard when they don't. Well, they succeed. They tend to succeed, as a matter of fact. By other people's standards, Saturn in the first house is pretty good, but they tend to take it a little hard up until around their Saturn return or so, at which point they become their own authority, which is sort of what happens with Saturn in Aries, but this is a much more direct thing. If things go well, they become their own authority. And then don't tell them what to do, because they know, right? They'll keep themselves in line. Nobody else has to keep them in line, because they'll do it. They'll do it for themselves. They're their own authority. This is the willpower kind of thing that you get. This becomes willpower. I will do. Kathy Formosa keeps coming into the waiting room. Um, I will do what I need to do in this situation. So Saturn in the first house, very, very, very much a tough thing early in life. And again, everything, wherever Saturn is, you do better in life as you get older, right? You probably have hesitations and delays and missteps up until your Saturn return, but as you go forward in life, that area of life gets better. It gets better. Same thing if you have Capricorn on the house cusp. You get better as you get older. Things get better as you get older. So that's something to look forward to. Hey, where have I got Saturn? I still got some improvement to go over here. It's a pretty cool thing. So Saturn in the first house. Saturn in the second house, it's finances, right? Indeed, staying afloat and making money and feeling financially secure is a real challenge. If you keep working at it, you can get very, very good at it. You still probably feel this, but I've only got $1 billion. And if something went wrong, then I might be knocked down to, if this deal doesn't go through, well, I'm only going to have 800 million, and then where will I be? This is Saturn in the second house. It doesn't, it's the perception. Even as you're succeeding, the perception is, oh. And again, like, you don't want it. So like, up until 30, I don't want money off. Yeah, my credit card bills are crazy, but I don't like looking at that stuff. When you finally settle down at some age or another and start paying attention to things and start doing the work, then you can start doing really well. But you got to put in the work. If you don't put in the work, Saturn won't help you, which is one of the big lessons of where Saturn is in your chart. Because if you don't put in the work, Saturn's not going to help. That's it. That's just it's like going up to a toll machine. Like in the old days when you throw the quarters into the machine and stuff like that. You don't have the quarters to throw in there. The gate's not going up. That's it. There's no real appeal when it comes to Saturn. You've got to do it. Saturn in the third house. Lots of siblings can be an issue, but of course, siblings can always be an issue. Um, with Saturn in the third house, very frequently peers, right? One's peers, the the local folks that are your your general age and location is the folks that you deal with on a regular basis and stuff like that. The local area, Saturn in the third, very difficult time with peers, difficult time with one's cohort, as it were. Um, Typically not a big fan of things like elementary school and elementary education. Often has difficult time understanding what's going on in terms of some of those basic skills. It just doesn't quite make sense. And communication with Saturn in the third, you sometimes get this kind of difficulty to express oneself, both in terms of content and sometimes just the difficulty in expressing yourself. Saturn creates hesitations, and you get a little bit of a sort of stutter kind of thing going on. Not everybody, of course, not everybody, but this is a possibility for it. It's just, it's hard to make communication. And your thoughts, which are very third house, your whole thought patterns tend to be very serious and certainly looking um, a little a little pessimistic. They have those folks that are like actuaries, the people who work for like insurance companies, calculating the risks of things going wrong and figuring out what could go wrong in this situation and stuff like that. Saturn in the third, man, that's your job. Figure out figure out what's going to go wrong. Well, all the avenues for failure are are put out there in big bold letters. I know what's going to go wrong here. That could over there. It's like, um, Jupiter says the glass is half full, Saturn says it's half empty, and very close to the edge of the table. So you better be careful. Um, Saturn in the fourth house. Here I will be a little psychological and say that with Saturn in the fourth house, early upbringing, one's early environment, you know, and I mean early, like sometimes even like pre-verbal, um, often not a warm environment, or the person doesn't feel that they fit into the family. They tend to have a little bit of a sense of like, like I'm the odd chip out over here. Um, really want to feel successful. Want to feel good with family. Want to feel in a secure environment. But with Saturn in that house, they typically don't feel that way. Um, and I should have said it earlier, but I'll say it right now. With Saturn in the fourth house, or whatever house Saturn is in, yes, you don't want to touch it. You don't want to go near that. It's like ew. But you tend to harbor someplace in the back of your mind the idea, but I could be really good at it. I could really be good at it. But I don't know, but I would probably fail. But if I didn't fail, I bet I'd be great at it. It's that kind of, you could think a little too much, a little too little sort of thing. All right, so So Saturn in the fourth house, by the way, yeah, finding a place to live and feel secure is often a bit of a challenge, but you can do better as you get older. And real estate is often something that the person is quite focused on because it is a tangible external thing instead of one's feelings about one's family and home and all of that kind of stuff. It becomes more like, well, what I can have is a piece of property, and that's kind of almost like a compensation type of thing. But where Saturn is, if you put in the effort, you can do well. So Saturn in the fourth, you could probably wind up being pretty successful with real estate if you put in the work. And that's the big caveat. With Saturn in the fifth house, among other things, you'll often see that there's a big hesitation about having children, and either maybe decide not to have children um, or have children relatively late in life, well, relatively late in consider well, men have this too, relatively late in life, and so there's often a hesitation around children. With Saturn in the fifth house, people often take fun very seriously. This is very. One of my friends has Saturn in the fifth, and he's like the organizer. Well, he was, for instance, when he was living in the country over here. But he was like the organizer, and he was fun, is this always has a beer in his hand, is fun, loves to joke and stuff like that. But he's also like, if somebody's had a little too much to drink, you got to go home. Like and he's a bartender now, and a bartender is a very Saturnian profession. Don't fool yourself, because you got to be the voice of reason, stability, amidst all these people that are getting bombed. You got to keep order. It's a very Saturnian profession. And you'll see that. And you often have, and where are you? You're at a bar, something that stops you, right? You are barred, right? You don't go on the other side of that bar. Yeah, there'll be hell to pay. Um, with Saturn in the fifth, often creativity is something that again the person takes very seriously. They have doubts about their creative stuff. This is, can be a little of an issue when it comes to you know they don't feel that what they're producing is all that great, when it comes to creative stuff. And the reason is that there's a great focus on the product. It's very Saturnian. There's a big focus on the product and less of an emphasis on the process that gets you there. And I mean, creativity is a process, and you got to experiment, you got to play. And with Saturn in the fifth house, play is just a serious business. Um, with Saturn in the sixth house, now, traditional astrologers would say that health problems, but I don't find that to be the case. With Saturn, it is the house of service, it is the house of work. Very frequently, one has hesitations around coworkers, and would it would probably do well to be in some kind of a service profession, although it may seem awful. But similarly, Saturn, as we've discussed previously, is the natural ruler of the 10th house, always has to do with career. By sign, Saturn often gives you a clue as to the type of career. So Saturn in Virgo, maybe it's like this is somebody for service. Saturn in Aries, military, police, or something like that, or security, or athletes, or anybody, or just an entrepreneur or something like that. Saturn by house also too gives you an indication for things that person might do for career. So Saturn in the second might be somebody, well, hold off on that for a second. Saturn in the third might be a teacher, someone who's instructing people. Again, you don't like elementary school, you don't like that stuff, but you can get good at it, and then you can turn your hesitations into success. As I said, Saturn in the fourth could be a real estate thing. Saturn in the fifth, it might be some creative type of thing. You can manage a rock group if you can't actually do it, you could at least manage it. Saturn in the sixth, service. When Saturn is in the seventh house, there's a lot of hesitation around relationship. And again, this is where you really get that approach avoidance thing. This is where you really get people thinking, oh, I'm just a loner. I'm never going to find anybody. Oh boy, it'd be great if I had a relationship. I would be the best, but I would really do everything for this. I would really work at it, but I'd probably suck. There's this kind of hesitation. When you see somebody in their 20s who has Saturn in the seventh and they tell you that they're in love, you don't say, well, no, it's not going to work out because you're not 30 yet. That would be a very bad thing to do. But you might keep in mind that it's going to be a little bit of a rough road there for them. And when until they get to 30, they're not quite sure about relationship, and where Saturn is, we tend to overcompensate, right? Because you feel like you're not good enough. So with Saturn in the seventh, early on, you start saying, well, let me try harder. Let me try harder. Um, Saturn in the seventh is also in the natal chart. If you're working with people one on one, like to be a psychologist, an astrologer, and so on, um, you would tend to have it's a lot of work, but you would tend to be very successful at that. It's a real positive indicator. I mean, after all, it is one-on-one relationships or things that you can work to develop, and Saturn's the indicator for career. So if you're working one-on-one with somebody in your career, it's a good thing. As always, you got to work. If you're not working, if you're trying to coast, Saturn will say no. With Saturn in the eighth house, well, it's a great position if you're looking to deal with other people's money. Um, that's really good. The eighth house, like the fourth house and the 12th house, the water houses, has a lot to do with emotions. And having Saturn in the eighth house can bring about some real heavy kinds of emotional things. Saturn in the eighth house is sort of uh, like the psychology of choice would probably be something like psychoanalysis. Like you're gonna go dig into your past and figure out why why you are the way you are, why you feel the way you feel. You've got to go in there and kind of dig that out. Um, with Saturn in the eighth, it can be, sometimes it is, that people have big hesitations around sex. And and that's another thing that, sometimes you see the overcompensation for that as well. And it's another indication of having hesitation around having children, particularly for women. And in this case, with Saturn in the fifth, there's hesitations about having children. With Saturn in the eighth, it's like, no, there's hesitations about giving birth. So you got to have the biological hardware to make that a thing to be concerned of. But with Saturn in the eighth, very frequently there's a hesitation around giving birth. Um, this is the kind of person who maybe through some family history or maybe through just, listening and hearing things and stuff like that becomes like really like, wow, bad things can happen at birth, which indeed, bad things can happen at birth to both mother and child. And so, and those types of stories tend to really stick with a person with Saturn in the eighth. Um, with Saturn in the ninth, there tends to be a hesitation. Well, first of all, there tends to be a hesitation around religion, and particularly the religion that one is born into. It seems somehow or another to just not be the thing. It doesn't quite work. Where Saturn is, you don't feel comfy, and ninth house is religion, and so it's just not quite right for you. Um, Also, higher education can be an issue. That might be the kind of, well, I don't really want to go to college type of thing. But also, higher education is, the yoga class, the astrology class, and all of these things as well. And so with Saturn in the ninth, there might be hesitations about that. It might take a little while to kind of to get moving with things. But if you do the work, then yeah, then it's good. Um, People with Saturn in the ninth may not be crazy about traveling, but like long distance travel. Um, they not infrequently travel for work or even sometimes work for like places that like companies that are based overseas or organizations that are based overseas, and things like that because it is still Saturn. But yeah, there tends not to be this sort of this great feel about ninth house stuff. And then again, you can put in the work and you can really excel in the area, but you have to do that. Now, Saturn in the 10th house, very, very happy. This is the house that he naturally rules, and so that's good. And so it's in the house of career, which is one of the indicators for Saturn. Saturn in the 10th house, it's not, however, unusual that it takes a little while to figure out what that career path is and then really get on it. But once you figure out what that career path is and you really get on it, you're going to have, good success. You know, comfy? No. Not not necessarily going to the astrologer will say, well, but you've got a great job and you're doing this one, and and the person will be like, yeah, but what but what about this other person that's doing better than me? And what about this other thing, this, and I don't know, the whole field could come collapse at any moment and stuff, so, and that's Saturn talking right over there. But, can do well, can do very well. You know, with any issue with Saturn and any other thing that we talk about that we say, well, there's a challenge and here's the thing that you get out of it and so on. When you meet a challenge, the planets, particularly Saturn, will just say, okay, well, we'll just talk about Saturn. Saturn puts you the challenge and then you meet the challenge and Saturn says, that's great. Look what you did. You did good. Here's your reward. And now, since you jumped over that bar, let's see if you can jump over this one. And that's very, very Saturn. And that's how you grow is by stretching and not just resting where you are, but you stretch and you grow. And that's why Saturn is so very helpful, right? Because if you didn't have that kind of impediment, if you weren't held back in a way and you didn't have some resistance, then you would just be Rhea. You would just flow. You would just go wherever, and there would be nothing. If you are going, you have to do some resistance training. In the Saturnian realm, in the realm of Saturn, you have to do resistance training, and that's what Saturn does for you. He gives you the resistance. He says you got to overcome this. Or you don't. You don't have to overcome it. But if you don't overcome it, you're not getting anything. And if you don't try, you're really not getting anything. That's the Saturnian deal that you get. So it is, in a way, the Saturn is the way that we grow. It's resistance training in life, and that's Saturn. Thank God there are other planets. Thank God there are other planets to make things a little bit easier for us sometimes. Thank God there's Jupiter, but Saturn is the resistance training we need. When Saturn is in the 11th, now the 11th house is naturally the Aquarius house, and so in the old days we would have said this was Saturn's natural domain, and he does function pretty well in the 11th house. It's hard to set long-term goals, but if they're set, then the person can really, this is the person who can have the vision of where things might be in, 10 years, 15 years, and they're going to work towards that, and they can do that. It tends to make things a little bit tough when it comes to friendships. Saturn in the 11th, probably a few really close friends rather than a big group. Um, Again, everything. I Saturn in the 11th is also somebody who can network if they learn how. If they learn how, they can be part of an association. They can, they can be part of like the Cobblers Guild or something like that, and they can do and they can rise to the top of the Cobblers Guild and 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 do really really well. Um, but it's hard to get started. It's hard to bring yourself in there and to participate in the group and things like that. So, there's a sort of if the third house is difficulty with one's peers, but it's a sort of narrower range. The 11th house is just sort of like a little bit of trouble with the collective or a larger group. And then there's Saturn in the 12th house. And Saturn in the 12th, uh, the feeling is frequently that whatever it is that's holding you back, whatever it is that is interfering, is somehow or another unknown. There is this kind of, I don't know exactly what it is, but this could be, not it is, but this could be the person who is like, I never get a break. This is every time I do something, everything collapses. Nothing works out for me. But why? I don't know. That's just the way it is. It's coming from the 12th house. It's coming from where you can't see things. With Saturn in the 12th, Saturn in the 12th house, I mean, if you have a career in places of confinement like hospitals, nursing homes, rehab centers, and prisons and monasteries, you'll do pretty well. Um, with Saturn in with Saturn in the 12th house, though, very frequently it's just the sense of like something's wrong and I can't put my finger on it. I just don't quite and really and the therapy, as it were, for Saturn in the 12th is to really go in there and pick apart the 12th house and Saturn and any aspects and things like that and try to figure out as much as possible what it is. That's the kind of thing where maybe it's like you, the person might benefit from like a past life regression or some sort of thing like that. You've got to have this kind of experiential, you got to bring light into the 12th house. Saturn is already the shadow side. It's already where things are kind of dark. And the 12th house is where you don't see things. And so it's like there's the shadow that's in the dark. And the only thing that you can do is to find some way to bring some light to it so you can understand it a little bit or a lot of it. And so it is a real challenge. Planets in the 12th in general are kind of challenging, but Saturn, it's often, it often, I mean, if you think about Saturn as like the Lord of Karma, if you do want to go that route with the description of Saturn, then Saturn in the 12th is sort of like I'm paying for something in the distant past, and I don't even know what it is. And that's, and that's what then you got to bring a little bit of illumination to it. Um, with Saturn also too, you could always flip it back out and say, I've been describing it more or less as the process that the person undergoes. Um, Most typically, where Saturn is by house, you don't like, and it's really relevant to only a few houses, like the third and the sixth and the ninth and the 10th and maybe the 11th. It's easily relevant. You don't like authority figures in those houses. You don't like going in those houses to begin with because Saturn is there, but you really don't like the authority figures that are there. No. This is, it's other. So you don't like being in that house, but of course, when you go into that house and you encounter people, you're not having a great time with them, and Saturn is authority, so very typically when you don't like the authority figures that you find in that house. In the sixth house, your immediate supervisor. In the 10th house, the big boss. In the ninth house, clergy. Saturn in the ninth house. Yeah, Father, what's his name? Not into that guy. Don't like him. as this, well, the rabbi? No, I don't like him. Yeah, that sort of thing predominates with Saturn in the ninth. Um, Saturn in the 11th. If you're not the president of the Cobblers Guild, you probably don't like the president of the Cobblers Guild all that much. Again, any of these things, you have to understand them, you have to bring them to light, you have to work on them. And that's what you do. Saturn is not, he's an obstacle, he's a barrier, but he is not, it's not like you cannot overcome it. He's not an immovable barrier. You just got to go get a good ladder and start climbing to get over that barrier. And it's gonna be some work, but you can do it. So Saturn by sign, a little bit. Saturn by house, a lot of it, a lot of it. And then the other thing to talk about when we're talking about Saturn is Saturn in aspect to other planets. Now, I know that aspects are for many people the Saturnian part of learning astrology. It's the barrier that you don't necessarily you can't get over. You don't want to think about it. Why are those things there? It's so complicated. I don't like it, type of thing. But when Saturn is connected to another planet, he puts that Saturnian flavor, that Saturnian color onto that planet, right? It will give you a Saturnian coloration. And Saturn's color is gray. Just in case you're wondering, it is a lead gray color. That is Saturn, right? This is so you could have the sun in Aries shining bright, this bright red shining sun, and then Saturn, but it's square to Saturn. All of that bright red light gets a little bit, there's a tinge of gray, it gets dimmed down a little bit a little bit. So, in a conjunction, Saturn really, really gives the flavor to the planet, right? If they're in the same sign, if they're conjunct each other, they're right next to each other. Saturn really, really brings out the Saturnian side of things. Um, uh, Hold on a second, 1 second. I gotta just open up the chat here for a second to answer a question. Yeah, well, yeah, I went over planet Saturn and the signs. Yeah, I briefly. It's because Saturn is there for a while. It's not the most important thing. It's not unimportant, but it's not quite. You don't get quite as much detail as we do with the houses. Now let's see. So Saturn in aspect to a planet, when it's conjunct, it gives a Saturnian coloration, and whenever that planet is trying to do, it has to go through Saturn. It's gotta deal with Saturn. So if the Sun is conjunct Saturn, right, my sense of self and what my life is about, oof, I don't know. There's doubt and hesitation about my very sense of self. But of course, you can build on it, you can work on it, and you can actually get quite strong. I know who I am and what I'm about. If you put in the work, then I know who I am and what I'm about. Saturn and the moon is a really, really tough aspect. One, if it's a hard aspect, it's a conjunction. So I should just say, so Saturn square the sun, Saturn square the sun. It's similar, but it's not quite as intense. One sometimes feels Saturnian, sometimes feels solar. Saturn opposite the sun, that's more like somebody else tells me that I'm not that I'm not that good, right? Somebody else is gonna, so, I feel it coming from others. I feel it coming from authority figures. Who I am, I'm not living up to their expectations. That's the opposition. The conjunction colors it, squares, but an opposition, you feel it coming from others. And I should say, if Saturn is trine or sextile to a planet, then is actually going to be very helpful, is going to have a steadying influence on that planet. Steady, an ST word. It's going to have a steadying influence on that planet, help it to develop step by step. Think about that Capricorn climbing up the mountain. Go step by step. That's what Saturn. That's what Saturn will do as a trine or a sextile. It opens up the possibility of developing that planet in a stepwise kind of fashion. And when the planet comes under stress, Saturn, whatever house he's in, whatever sign he's in, Saturn will help, right? So we want to know that. When Saturn is with the moon, again, a conjunction and a square, it's nurturing came at a price. Nurturing came at a price. Often there's a feeling that the nurturing parent, the mother usually, is kind of distant for whatever reason, and don't throw it on the mom. This is this person's chart, this is the way this person is perceiving the situation. It's doesn't have to do too much with the objective circumstances. But that the moon wants to feel secure. The moon wants to feel that it is, safe. It's all our security needs nurtured. And with Saturn, it's like sort of a steely kind of good enough energy. That's that kind of like, well, you know, I got food, I got clothing, I got shelter. I would have really liked the cupcake on my birthday, but mom was at work. And maybe mom was at work. With Saturn, very frequently that's what happens. It's work. The mother is working and isn't able to be quite the nurturing mom that might otherwise be. The parents are working or whatever. Um, Again, in a harmonious aspect, like a trine or a sextile to the moon, Saturn will usually indicate the person is able to keep their emotions nice and steady and express them in a measured amount and so on. That's good. When Saturn is opposite the moon, when Saturn is opposite the moon, somebody somehow is telling you that your feelings are not great, not what they should be, not good. And that's just the perception. That's just the perception of like, oh, yeah, that's that's the kind of well, this is not a Saturn moon story because the entire family has it, but my ex brother-in-law's family, like if you fell down and hurt yourself, the reply from the parents was rub it. I hurt my arm, rub it. That was just. Oh yeah, I guess I feel better. It's very Saturn opposite the moon. You know, we'll take it to the hospital if we need to, but other than that, this is we're not giving you a lot of emotional support type of thing. And we don't want to hear your belly aching. That's what they heard a lot of. We don't want to hear your belly aching. But I'm sad about this thing. Well, sad things happen. That would be Saturn opposite the moon. Yeah, sad things happen. That's true. You get used to it. And that's Saturn opposite the moon. Saturn tangles with Venus. Well, okay, with Saturn and Mercury. In general, the hard aspects of Saturn and Mercury, the conjunction, the square, and the opposition, represent a hesitation in expression. One hesitates to express oneself. In the case of the opposition, as we would expect, it's usually because somebody else said, "I don't like what you're doing. I don't like what you said. I don't like, just shut up." That's kind of what Saturn opposite Mercury is. Just shut up. Um, in a trine relationship or a sextile relationship, things are much more harmonious and things tend to go much better, and the person is able to communicate in a very measured, methodical way. Of course, the sign that Mercury is in matters a lot, and the sign that Saturn is in matters too. But in general, we're talking about this. Venus. Now, Saturn and Venus are a hard deal over here. When Saturn tangles with Venus, there tends to be a lot of hesitation around the area of relationship. The love life tends to be one that is something that is kind of, it's sort of unapproachable. Like, I don't know. It's like having Saturn in the seventh, but it's like, Venus is the sense of worth. It's the sense of what you want in a partner, what you want in someone, and so with Saturn there, it's very, very hard to feel that you're going to get, what anything good. And of course, Saturn does, in fact, put in delays and hesitations and things like that. So it's not unusual for there to be a real lag there and having some difficult time. With the conjunction in the square, the person often feels that they're kind of unworthy, you know. But with the square, because Saturn is an indicator for career, this is the person who you find the love of your life and your job says, "Hey, guess what? We're moving you across the country and we're giving you a big promotion." Oh boy, now I've got a dilemma. Or, I'm doing really, really well at work, and I'm doing great, but I went on a trip across the country and I found somebody I might be the love of my life, and now what am I going to do? You see, you've got this sort of push-pull between love and career with a square. And then with an opposition, it frequently comes out as being it's a real one or the other seesaw. Again, it's like, you often resolve the Saturnian problem with relationship when Venus is opposite Saturn, and it happens with almost any aspect of Venus to Saturn. You look for people who are more established and perhaps older. Venus opposite Saturn, particularly because the opposition is usually played out with other people. So somebody that is older, somebody that is more established, somebody that's kind of serious, seems like the person that you would want to have. This is the good partner for you. But again, with Saturn and Venus, that feeling of, I mean, it can really spiral into a sense of loneliness and I'll never find somebody. You have to be very careful about that. It takes time and it takes work and it takes it real and the work, I should say, has a lot to do with understanding what you want and what you need in relationships and what you want and what you really need in a partner. Because Saturn will give you what you really need. Saturn will give you the essential thing, but will not give you the fluff, right? So you got to figure out, looking at Venus and just looking at yourself, what are those things that I really need? And then you focus on that. But when you start going like, well, I'd like her to be tall and blonde and not gonna work. I want somebody who makes blah blah blah. Doesn't work. The essential things. You can have the essential things, but it's rarely the case that you get like all the different fluff and stuff like that. Um, Saturn and Mars are really a good pair in many respects. Saturn can sort of damp down the sex drive a little bit when he's in an aspect to Mars. Can sort of cool things off a little bit because it's Saturn, and Saturn cools things off, and. But in general, Mars as our energy and drive, right? Saturn helps to put a puts a keel on the boat, you might say. It keeps things steady, keeps Mars in line. Mars is ready to go here, ready to go there, this thing, that thing. Saturn, no, we're doing one thing at a time. Mars is exalted, you may recall. Mars is exalted in Saturn's sign of Capricorn for exactly that reason, because he puts his energy to a purpose and, step by step fulfills it. So an aspect from Saturn to Mars in the natal chart is not necessarily all that bad, except it can be hard to act. There's the thing, you know. Um, for measured long-term projects, Saturn, Mars is great. But when you just got to act, you got to make a decision and do something. Saturn puts in the hesitation. Mars is like, oh, I'm going to go do it. And Saturn goes, no, let's think about this. I have a client with Saturn directly opposite Mars to the minute. And every time she's going to do something of any significance, she sends me an email or we have a call or something like that, and she wants to know when's a good time. And I work it out within her time parameters and so on. And I'll say, okay, so next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, if this is, this is what you do. Sometime around next Thursday, she will send me an email saying, I didn't do it. When is the next best time in the next couple of weeks? And I'll go back and find a good time. And it was this, when it was this, and I'll give it to her. And she'll say, thank you very much. And then sometime in the next couple of weeks, she will send me an email saying, I'm not sure if I should do this at all. Yeah, I know. This is the way Saturn is opposite Mars. Mars wants to act. Saturn says no, hesitation. So hesitation in action. That's the problem when it comes to short-term actions. But if the person, like sets themselves on like, for career and things like that, it actually winds up over the long term, it works really well. In a harmonious, a trine or a sextile between Saturn and Mars is great. That's like unbeatable because now Mars is steadied by Saturn's heavy hand. Then really, like, this is really the keel on the boat. You can sail along at top speed because you're not going to fall over. Saturn is the steadying influence. So Saturn, Mars is good. Saturn, Jupiter, it's the same general thing, only it applies to belief systems and philosophy and religion and things like that. It's rarely what people are ringing up the doorbell for. Hey, come on, I gotta talk to you about this though. I'm having questions about my philosophy of life. Doesn't come up a lot. Not a major issue for most folks. Um, of course, with all of these things, I have to remind you that the flip side of the coin is the houses that these planets rule. So, yes, Saturn is opposite Venus, or Saturn is conjunct Venus or square Venus. What does it mean for a relationship is the primary consideration. But we would also look to see what houses Venus rules, because that's going to get a little slow down too, because Saturn's influence is strong, right? Saturn is next to Venus. Saturn is holding Venus in place. Well, Venus is the ruler of the third house. So the third house has a little hesitation around it because Saturn is grabbing its ruler. And this is just right back to what we were doing last week. You want to know about a house, you look and see where the ruler is. What sort of condition is the ruler in? Is it in a sign that it likes so it can function well? Is it in an aspect that is good, or is it in an aspect that is a little more challenging? And that tells you how that house is getting along. So we could look at it either way, which is why I know I keep hammering on it, and I will do so more next week, which is why transits are such an important part of learning, because rather than looking at the natal chart and trying to figure everything out, you look at what transits are happening to the person's chart now, and then you see what in the natal chart is getting lit up by the planets in the sky now, and usually it's Saturn that you're looking at over here, and that's what the person's going to want to focus on. That's where the person's interest is, right? So you don't have to understand the whole chart. You go, oh, you got this going on. But then you do it backwards. You just look and see what's going on in this area of life. And that's why you would look and see, well, if you're having a relationship issue now, I understand what's happening. Look at the transits. But let me look and see what's going on in the natal chart in your house of relationship. And that's when it becomes important. That's when it becomes really relevant, rather than looking at 12 houses and 10 planets and trying to figure out everything. You figure, well, what's going on now? Well, what do I need to look at now? Okay, that just wanted to have that there for you. Let's see, are there any questions? You can raise a hand. You can type it in the chat. You can. It's it's Saturn, so you have to raise your hand. I'm sorry. It's Saturn. We're talking about Saturn. You can't just talk. You have to raise your hand. You're going on. Mary.
Two questions. Am I muted? I typed it in the chat. What is the orb you use when you're looking at the natal chart and the Saturn?
Oh,
Ah,
well, it depends on orbs. Orbs are always dependent on the planets, right? So the sun and the moon get bigger orbs than, let's say, Mars. Um, and it matters. Okay, for simplicity's sake, about 5 degrees. About 5 degrees. With
Kind
Saturn, about 5 degrees. You give more to the sun and the moon. But, and this is the part that some of you may hate, um, if the faster moving planet is heading towards Saturn, right? I give a bigger orb than if the faster moving planet has passed Saturn. So let's say if Venus is at, where's Saturn today? If we're at 20, Venus is going to be in a couple of weeks. Let's say Venus is at 20 degrees of Virgo, and Saturn is opposite that at 26 degrees of Pisces. That's a 6 degree orb. But Venus is going to keep going forward 21, 22, 23. Well, Saturn relatively stays still 23, 24, 25, 26. That aspect is going to become exact. Whereas if Venus was at 28 degrees of Virgo and Saturn was at 26, Venus is going to go 29. It's going to go into Libra and is moving away from the opposition to Saturn. I would give a smaller orb. So, and you can just, I mean, you know how fast the planets move, and this works for any aspect with any planets. You know how fast they move relative to each other. Moon, Sun, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mercury, and Venus kind of together and variable, and then Mars, Jupiter, and how you know the order of the planets and how fast they move. And so you see an aspect, you go, well, is this an aspect that is forming? Is the faster moving planet going to catch up to the slower moving planet, or is it fading? It's in the past. It'll still have an effect, but you use a smaller orb if it's fading. But in the natal chart, if you did 5 degrees for Saturn, you'd be okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There's nobody else. I will stop recording and say goodbye to our watching on YouTube friends.